All right, welcome to Unit 3, where we're going to talk about cellular energetics. In AP Bio, I would argue that Unit 3 is probably one of the more challenging units, especially when we talk about the inner functions of the mitochondria and the chloroplast, but that will be later on. In this section of notes, what we're going to do is basically just jump right into the basics and the intro to cellular energetics, talk about some vocab terms that are really necessary to know before we jump into more complicated topics. So it's really important to understand these terms and understand how energy flows, because at the end of the day, what we want to do is be able to understand how does the cell produce energy, and where does this energy come from, and how is that energy being used. So we're going to jump right into it and first talk about this term metabolism. We've probably heard this term metabolism before, in regards to our diets and how we exercise and how people metabolize certain foods at different rates, things like that. But what metabolism actually is all of the chemical reactions that are happening inside of an organism. And this includes building up things and also breaking down things. So metabolic pathways are basically a series of chemical reactions that either build up complex molecules or break down complex molecules. And so all of these things will require energy. Sometimes these things are spontaneous, and we'll talk more about that later. But what I really want to indicate here is, if you might remember from regular bio, we have enzymes here, like enzyme 1, 2, and 3. And we have things called substrates, and we have things called products, right? So these things are going to be the before and after a chemical reaction. Now, like I mentioned before, reactions can occur spontaneously, but the rate at which they occur spontaneously usually is really, really, really slow. And so we need enzymes to help with the speeding up of this process. If you remember from chemistry, the term for something that speeds up a reaction that does not actually be part of the reaction, that thing is called a catalyst. And so enzymes are catalysts. And over here, what we have is a substrate turning into a product, but in the meantime, it jumps through a couple of intermediate steps. So a substrate, like we have, let's say we have like a polysaccharide, like starch, like you ate some noodles or had some potatoes, and those are really rich in starch. But we need to break those down into the final product, which is going to be glucose. So enzyme 1 might break that polysaccharide into disaccharides, and that would be like your intermediate. And then that disaccharide can be broken down again from a different enzyme into its final product. That would be an example of just using two enzymes, but you get the idea where you take something and you need to turn it into a final product. It might actually take one step, sometimes it might take several steps in order to get there. And so this entire process is what's referred to as metabolism. All right, now in organisms, there are two types of metabolic pathways. The first one is called the catabolic pathway, and these are pathways that are going to be releasing energy by breaking down complex molecules into simpler compounds. We have a lot of catabolic pathways inside of our own bodies, mammals especially. Anything that is warm-blooded is going to have a lot of catabolic pathways. And this is actually where a lot of our internal temperature comes from. The average human body temperature is 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit, and all of that heat comes from the release of energy from catabolic pathways. And over here, I have a little GIF just to show you. We have glucose being broken down into something else from a little enzyme, the little orange thing. We'll just come in, break apart that glucose into its separate products. You also have anabolic pathways, and these are going to be pathways that consume energy to build complicated molecules from simpler compounds. So sometimes we need to join monomers together to form a polymer. Like for instance, let's say we wanted to build a protein. The monomer of proteins are going to be, of course, amino acids. That whole process will require energy in order to do that. So if we ever need to build a molecule, we have enzymes that can do that too. And so we take these two monomers, we join them together, and we'll talk more about how enzymes work later in a separate note. I believe that's going to be notes 2 of this unit. But it's really important to understand that these two catabolic pathways also kind of flow cyclically. and that kind of forms what your metabolism is. You have your catabolic pathways, your catabolism, and this is basically going to be breaking things up into its individual components and also getting energy from that. But then that energy can be later stored and then used later for anabolic pathways to build up molecules. And so this is really important to understand that this whole thing is cyclical, not only within an organism, but throughout all of nature and biology, right? So there are things that are going to be building up energy, and then things that will consume that energy and then break that down. So it's a very cyclical, kind of like a circle of life thing. Now, when we talk about energy, we want to define it. If you've taken a physics course, or if you remember from like chemistry, energy is basically the ability to do work. And so, how does that tie into biology? Well, organisms need energy to survive and function. And so, what we see is that there is a loss in energy flow that will eventually result in death. If you don't have energy, the organism will basically die, right? So we need to have a consistent flow of energy in order to survive and function. Now, when we talk about energy in broad terms, there's different forms of energy, and these are the types that we typically refer to. Kinetic energy, this is going to be energy associated with motion, often referred to anything that can move, from a simple bacteria with like a flagella or something like that. Or even just mammals that move around pretty often. Those things are going to have kinetic energy, just being able to move around. There's also thermal energy, and this is going to be energy associated with the movement of atoms and molecules. So basically, anytime you have a lot of movement of your internal molecules, that's going to be thermal energy. That's basically what temperature is. A temperature is basically a measurement of how fast molecules are moving. Potential energy is going to be stored energy that can be used later or converted into a different form of energy. In mammals, that energy is typically stored as glycogen or also as fat, so that we can store that energy and then use it later. And there's finally chemical energy, and this is potential energy available for release in a chemical reaction. So, if we break apart a molecule, like we saw in the catabolic pathway here, if we break apart a molecule, that's going to create energy. That's often going to release an energy. The most common form of chemical energy that we're going to refer to, of course, is ATP. When we break that bond from the last phosphate group in ATP, which I'll talk about later, basically what's going to happen is that release of chemical energy can be converted into different forms of energy. All right, so when we talk about converting energy, well, that's actually a law of thermodynamics. And we'll talk more about that in just a second, but we do need to tie in a little bit of physics here when we talk about the laws of thermodynamics. Thermodynamics is the study of energy transformations in matter, and these are laws. So in science, the difference between like a law and a theory is that laws can be proven with math and calculations and things like that, and they are essentially unbreakable. You cannot break these laws. They apply to the universe as a whole, and they're very important to understand when it comes to energy flow. And the first law of thermodynamics is basically that energy cannot be created or destroyed. You cannot destroy energy. If you're doing a calculation with energy, you can't just discount it and say, this energy doesn't matter. It can't go anywhere. It needs to either be transferred or somehow transformed, or it can also stay the same. So if you have like potential energy, it could stay as potential energy, or you can take potential energy and convert it later. So like the example that I have here, the chemical energy that is inside of this nut right here that this squirrel's about to eat, that will be transformed into kinetic energy for the squirrel later to be able to climb a tree. It looks like it's fall in this picture, and the squirrel, not to body shame, but it looks pretty healthy. Let's just say that. So it's probably packing on a little bit of weight right before hibernation, right before winter. And so what is it doing? It's taking all of this chemical energy that's in this nut. It is storing it as potential energy in the form of fat. And then later in the springtime, as it moves around, and in the summertime as well, it will use that potential energy to turn it into kinetic energy, to be able to move around And but also in the wintertime, it'll keep the squirrel alive. So all that potential energy will keep the squirrel alive throughout the winter, so it doesn't need to be looking for nuts in the winter, and it'll stay alive. Just remember, because without that energy flow, we wouldn't be able to keep the squirrel alive or the organism alive. So you can see that we're transferring the energy from one form to another. We went from the chemical energy in the nut to potential energy stored as fat, and then that potential energy is going to be turned into kinetic and probably even thermal energy for the squirrel as the winter progresses and then we go into spring. So that's the first law of thermodynamics. The second law of thermodynamics tells us that the energy transformation increases the entropy of the universe. So that's a new vocab term. We'll talk more about that later. But basically, the more transformation of energy sources that you have, the more disorder that you're going to have in the universe. And during the energy transfers or transformation, some of energy is usable and often lost as heat. So the energy transfer from, let's go back to the previous picture where we have this squirrel with a nut. The chemical energy in the nut going to potential energy as fat, and then the potential energy turning into kinetic energy as the squirrel moves. There's never going to be an instance where 100% of the energy is transferred from one source to another. So there's never going to be an instance where 100% of the chemical energy in the nut will turn into and result to 100% of the energy stored as fat, and that 100% of fat will not be turned into 100% of the energy used for kinetic energy. So always you're going to have an instance where some of that energy in the process of conversion is going to be lost as heat. And the more conversions you do, the more heat you're going to lose. And so that's the second law of thermodynamics. The more times you have to transfer the energy from one type to another, the more of it is going to be lost often as heat. There are sometimes instances, maybe not in biology, but there are instances where some of that energy is lost as light instead of heat, but it doesn't always have to be heat. But in biology, it's almost always going to be heat. So here's our example that as a squirrel climbs a tree, some energy is going to be released as heat, not only within the muscle fibers of the squirrel, but also there's going to be a little bit of friction between the pads of the paws of the squirrel and the bark of the tree. There's going to be friction so that the squirrel can climb up, and with friction, there's heat. It's going to be a minuscule amount, not something that we could probably measure with like an instrument, but there is a loss of heat there. So just keep that in mind, that in the second law, as we transfer from one energy source to another, a lot of energy is lost, usually in the form of heat. All right, and that actually brings us to our very important formula here, and this is the free energy formula. This is actually on your formula sheet, and it's really important to understand what all of these terms mean, so we're going to walk through this. The term free energy refers to the likelihood of reactions in organisms, or if the reactions are energetically favorable. So if something's energetically favorable, it will happen, or the likelihood of a reaction to occur, we can measure it based off of this formula here. So we've got a couple of terms here. We've got this symbol, this triangle symbol in all three of our terms. That is actually a Greek letter called delta. So if you've taken like a higher level math, you'll know that delta means change in. So delta G, the first term, is the change in free energy. So this is going to be our final value that we're going to be calculating. This is called the Gibbs free energy, Gibbs, Gibbs free energy. And whenever this number is going to be negative, that means our reaction is going to be spontaneous. It's just going to occur on its own. All right, and so that's really important to understand, that spontaneous reactions, when we get to a negative Gibbs free energy, they're just going to occur on their own. How do we measure Gibbs free energy? Well, we take the heat of whatever we have, or the change in total energy that we have in a system, and then we subtract it by the change in entropy multiplied by the absolute temperature in Kelvin. All right, so there's a lot of stuff going on here. It's actually not too complicated. I know it seems really complicated at first, but we're going to walk through what these terms mean. The first thing I do want to note here, if you've never encountered the Kelvin scale, Kelvin is just another scale for temperature. It's not measured in degrees, so you wouldn't say degrees Kelvin. It's just Kelvin. And the Kelvin scale is based off of a temperature called absolute zero, and that is the absolute coldest temperature that you can possibly have. And so why do we use the Kelvin scale here? Well, we want to make sure that this number here stays negative. And so if we used Celsius, there are such things as negative degrees in Celsius. So if we plugged in a negative temperature here in the T variable, well, if we minus that negative, it'll actually turn positive. So we want to make sure that doesn't happen by keeping the lowest possible value as absolute zero. So when we have zero as our lowest number, that means that this value can't turn into a positive value. So Kelvin, it can directly convert from Celsius. I think what you have to do is take Celsius and then add 273 point something. I think it's like 0.15. And that's the value that you would add to Celsius in order to convert it from Celsius to Kelvin. Just one other note that this change in entropy value, this delta S, when we have a value that's greater than zero, then we have more disorder. And when we have a value that's less than zero, we have increased order. Okay? And we should know that, one more thing before we move on, we should know that when we increase the temperature of a reaction, we should remember from chemistry that increasing a temperature, of course, will increase the reactivity of it, which will then increase the disorder or the molecules moving around, right? So that's what we refer to as the entropy. All right, so let's cover some vocab terms really quick before we move on, because this can be kind of tricky. So we want to make sure that we understand all of these terms before we move forward. The first one is going to be entropy. And entropy, like we've talked about before, is the lack of order. It's the unavailability of a system's thermal energy to be converted to mechanical energy. And what that basically means is that there's going to be more disorder. There's going to be more things not together. And entropy will usually result in chaos if temperatures are really extreme. When we think about, let's say, we're looking at individual water molecules in a container, and if we are boiling that water instead of keeping it at room temperature, it's going to be much harder to predict where those water molecules are going to be because there's going to be disorder. So that's what's referred to as entropy. Enthalpy is going to be the exact opposite. That's like we have order, we have structure. It's going to be the internal energy of a system. It's not going to have anything coming in from the outside, so that's going to be the enthalpy. Okay. Two types of reactions that we see exergonic and endergonic reactions. An exergonic reaction is going to be a reaction that releases energy. An exothermic reaction is going to be an example of an exergonic reaction. An exothermic reaction releases heat. And again, that's just an example of an exergonic reaction. Not all exergonic reactions are exothermic, but all exothermic reactions are exergonic. Right? There are like reactions that would instead release light, for instance. And light is just another form of energy. There are some reactions that are endergonic, and that's going to be a reaction that absorbs energy. And there are reactions that are endothermic as well. So that's going to be a reaction that absorbs heat. And that's just an example of endergonic. So this is going to be the exact opposite. Just an example of an exergonic reaction. Let's say you burn something, like you take a piece of wood and you light it on fire. That's going to be the wood burning and turning into carbon dioxide and whatever the byproducts are. That's going to be an exergonic reaction because it releases heat. It's specifically an exothermic reaction, but it also releases some light, so it is an exergonic reaction. An endergonic reaction is going to be like those instant ice packs. If you've ever played a sport or have seen one of these before, it's basically an ice pack that has two components inside of a bag, and when you break one of those components and it mixes with the other, it'll turn into basically an instant ice pack, and that's going to be an endergonic reaction that will absorb heat. All right, so it's really important to understand all these vocab terms, and we're going to kind of talk about these when we refer to the Gibbs free energy equation that we just mentioned before. The free energy of the reactions determine whether or not the reaction occurs spontaneously. And so what does that mean for a reaction to occur spontaneously? Basically, no outside input of energy is required. And based off of the free energy changes, chemical reactions can be classified as either exergonic or endergonic, like we just talked about before. And what you will have to be able to do with this Gibbs free energy equation is be able to use and interpret this equation to determine if a particular process will occur spontaneously or non-spontaneously. So I know it looks like a lot of math involved, there's a lot of terms that are brand new, but it's actually not that bad of a concept if you encounter this on an AP exam, where we basically want to understand, is this process inside of the cell that I'm looking at, is it going to be occurring spontaneously or is it non-spontaneous? And again, the way we calculate that or figure that out is by looking at this final value here, this delta G. We saw that earlier, where if it's a negative value, if this value is less than 0, then it will occur spontaneously. And the more negative it is, the bigger negative value, the more spontaneous it's going to be. Likewise, the exact opposite is true. If it's a positive value, it's going to be non-spontaneous. You do need to put in some energy. And again, the bigger this number is, the more energy you have to input to get that reaction going. Okay? So delta G is, again, the change in free energy. If it's a positive number, it's an endergonic reaction. If it's a negative value, it's an exergonic reaction. Delta H is the change in enthalpy for the reaction. So if it's a negative value, it's an exothermic reaction. If it's positive, it's endothermic. T is temperature in Kelvin, and delta S is the change in entropy. So if it's a positive value, the entropy is increasing. If it's a negative value, the entropy is decreasing, and we are moving towards order instead of disorder. All right, so let's take a look at a practice problem using the Gibbs free energy equation. This problem reads that if at 298 Kelvin, the delta G is going to be negative 190.5 kilojoules. Let's just pause and talk about this unit right here. If you've never seen kilojoules, joules is basically just a unit of energy. So that's basically the unit that we're going to use to measure the energy. And we have negative 190.5 kilojoules for our delta G, and delta H is going to be negative 184.6 kilojoules for this reaction. So in this reaction, we have hydrogen gas mixing with chlorine gas, and that's going to give us 2 hydrochloric in gas form, or hydrogen chloride in gas form. So we want to calculate the standard entropy, delta S, for this reaction. So a couple of things really quick. We know that this reaction is going to be spontaneous. How do we know this reaction is spontaneous? Because they already gave us the delta G in the beginning. Delta G here is going to be negative 190.5 kilojoules. And that's going to be at a specific temperature, right? So temperature is really, really important when we talk about how spontaneous a reaction is. So going back to this really quick, this equation in the middle, this number may or may not be a positive or negative number depending on what the temperature is, right? So for instance, if I had a container of gasoline, we all know gasoline is a very flammable fluid. If I just put some in the container, like a cup, gasoline by itself at room temperature will not ignite. It will not set on fire. It will be pretty much safe as long as nothing really interacts with it, until we increase the temperature. If we start increasing the temperature of that gasoline, at some point we will get to the point where this value will make this value over here a negative value, at which point we will then have a spontaneous reaction. So let's just remember that at a specific temperature, delta G can be positive or it could be negative depending on what that temperature is. So in this example, we have a temperature of 298 Kelvin, and then that'll give us a delta G of a negative value, giving us a spontaneous reaction. So what we want to do is basically plug in all of these values into this equation to figure out what our missing variable is. We have delta G, we have delta H, we have temperature in Kelvin, and now what we need to do is figure out delta S. So you can pause here for a moment if you'd like to figure that out. But the answer that I got here was negative 0.0198 kilojoules, and that's what I got for delta S. So let's talk quickly about the two different types of reactions that we'll see as we progress through this unit. The first type of reaction that we're going to talk about is an exergonic reaction. And again, these are going to be reactions that release energy. Where are we going to see this? We're going to see this a lot when we talk about cellular respiration. Cellular respiration, before we get into the big heavy lecture of it, is basically the process of us converting glucose and oxygen into our energy sources that we use. So we as mammals, for instance, we need energy, and that energy comes in the form of food and oxygen, and those are going to be our reactants. The products that we get from that are going to be at a lower energy state than the higher reactants. So this is an example of an exergonic reaction. So a lot of times to talk about exergonic reactions, we need to understand that the reaction is usually going to be spontaneous, but that's not without an initial energy input. So I'd like to focus really quickly on this graph on the right side here. The x-axis is going to represent the reaction rate over time, and the y-axis is going to represent the amount of energy available in the system. So we start here on the far left with the reactants, and they're going to be at a specific energy state. And what we need to do is we need to input a little bit of energy into the system and get those reactants to a point where they're at a very high energy state. Once we've done that, we can then get a big output. Once the energy has gotten to a specific point, it'll quickly dip down into a lower energy state. At this point where my cursor is, that's basically where the reaction starts to become spontaneous. So right there, that's where the reaction becomes spontaneous, and the whole reaction is going to take place, and then the products will end up just leveling out at another energy state. Another quick example that I can give you of a reaction like this is going back to that example of the gasoline. If you just had a container of gasoline just sitting there, that's sitting at a specific energy state, right? The gasoline molecules themselves, they have a specific temperature, they have potential energy there, but they're sitting at a specific energy state. It's not until you apply a specific amount of another energy source that will cause the whole reaction to take place. So let's say we want to burn this gasoline. Well, you need to input some energy. So if we're talking about like the innards of an internal combustion engine of a car, you can't just like pour gasoline into the engine and expect it to ignite on its own. You have things called spark plugs, and the spark plugs will actually provide just a little bit of energy, enough energy to spark, provide electricity that will spark the fumes of the gas, ignite it, and cause the whole reaction to take place. So that's just another example of an exergonic reaction. But a lot of times we do need to overcome this initial hill that we see right over here, and that's going to be like our little input of energy. But that input of energy is usually way less than the energy that we get out of the system. An endergonic reaction is going to be a reaction that will actually absorb energy. And we're going to talk a lot about this when we get to photosynthesis. That's going to be another section of notes. This is going to be a reaction that is not spontaneous. You do need to put in a form of energy in order to get the product. So this does require a bit of energy or work in order for it to actually happen. So over here we have the reactants at a starting spot, and the products will actually be at a higher energy level than the reactants. And this does require a decent spike of energy. We do need to put in a lot of energy in the system. Now for photosynthesis, this only really makes sense for plants to do if they had a constant form of energy. So what is this constant form of energy that they're constantly receiving? Well, it's basically for the plant, it's going to be like it's the unlimited source of energy, which is the sun. So for the plant's lifetime, as far as it knows, it's basically going to always have the sun available, and the sun is constantly providing energy throughout the day. So it will be able to provide that energy necessary to form the reactants into the products. So that's going to be an endergonic reaction, something that will actually need to absorb energy. Now, next section of notes, we're going to talk about more about enzymes and how that works. But this energy that we talked about before, or this hill rather that we talked about before, this is that transition state. This is what's called the activation energy. Okay, so the activation energy is the energy without an enzyme. That's going to be this red hill over here. This is the amount of energy that we need to input into the system in order to get this reaction going. So let's say our reactants are going to be at a specific energy state, and in order to get them to the products, we do need to overcome this large hill. Okay, that's without an enzyme. With an enzyme, the enzyme is going to act as a catalyst. It will actually decrease the amount of energy required. So it doesn't speed up the reaction. All it does is make the reaction easier to happen. So an enzyme makes reactions easier to happen by simply reducing the amount of energy necessary in order to get from the reactants to the products. So imagine like you're just rolling a ball from one end here to here. That's what you want to do. You want to be able to roll the ball. If you had to roll the ball up this massive hill, that would be quite the challenge. Eventually, you would get it down the hill to get to the products. But what an enzyme could do is just make that hill shorter to make the entire journey easier for going from reactants to products. So just keep that in mind when we talk about enzymes in the next section of notes, that enzymes don't really do anything to the reactants and products themselves. They don't speed up the reaction. All they do is make the activation energy lower so that basically it's easier to go from reactants to products. Now, cells will perform three kinds of major work in regards to energy usage. There's, of course, mechanical work. That's going to be movement. An example of that is the beating cilia. Cilia is basically like these little finger-like hairs on the outside of a cell. Some cells, when they move, they have like these little tiny hairs on the outside that will move in unison, kind of like rowers on a rowing team. They all row their oars at the same time. So it's kind of like that, these tiny little hairs moving at the same time, and the cell will need energy in order to move those. Whenever we need to move chromosomes around for cellular replication during mitosis or meiosis, that's going to require movement, and that's mechanical energy. And then also in animals, or we see the mechanical motion of muscle cells. That's going to require a lot of energy as well. That's another example of mechanical energy. All cells will need to be able to transport molecules, and so we have things like pumps within the cell membrane, if you remember from Unit 2. This is going to be stuff that is going to be pumping substances across the membrane against spontaneous movement. A great example of this is going to be active transport. So if you remember the difference between passive and active transport will always require energy. Passive transport does not require energy. You know, like if you remember osmosis, facilitated diffusion, those are all examples of passive transport, but active transport does require energy, and that is a form of work that a cell needs to do. And then finally, there's going to be chemical work, which is basically going to be the synthesis of molecules. If we want to build up polymers through a dehydration synthesis, that is going to require energy in order to do that. Okay, and what's that big energy molecule that's going to help with all of that? That's going to be ATP. That's adenosine triphosphate. This molecule that organisms use as a source of energy to perform work, this is going to be universal throughout the biology world. In all of the cells that we see adenosine triphosphate as the main energy source that is able to do the work. Now, this might look familiar to you, and I hope it does, because this whole molecule, if we were to cut off these two phosphates, these two last blue ones on the end, we would have a nitrogenous base, a ribose sugar, and then a phosphate group. So we should be able to identify what kind of macromolecule this is. So ATP is just a modified version of a nucleic acid. And where adenine is our nitrogenous base, we have our ribose sugar, but instead of just one phosphate group, we actually have 3 phosphate groups. And that's actually going to be really important because it's the bonds within these phosphate groups that we see the energy storage. Okay, so organisms will obtain energy by breaking that bond between the second and third phosphate in a hydrolysis reaction. So once we have water involved here, and we use water to break apart that bond between the two phosphates, we're going to see a big release in energy. Now, the adenosine triphosphate will turn into adenosine diphosphate, and adenosine diphosphate can then later be turned into adenosine triphosphate. We'll talk more about that later in cellular respiration, but that does require inputting that energy back in. So we'll talk more about that later. So all we really need to understand at this point is, where does the energy come from in a cell? It's going to come from that second and third bond, or the bond between the second and third phosphate in the adenosine triphosphate molecule. Like I mentioned before, ATP can be regenerated from ADP via the ATP cycle. So we have ATP plus water, a hydrolysis reaction that will give us the energy for cellular work. And then we take that last phosphate group and add it back to ADP, and then we get energy from the exergonic process to form it back into ATP. This whole process, this is a very important vocab word. This whole process, when we add a phosphate group to ATP, that's called phosphorylation. Very, very important vocab word. Phosphorylation is the released phosphate moves to another molecule to give energy. So when we take that phosphate group and we put it onto something else, that's called phosphorylation, and that's where the energy comes from. Okay, so we'll look more about that later when we talk about cellular respiration, but that's really important to understand that when ATP breaks that bond, I'm going to go back a slide. When ATP breaks that bond between the second and third phosphate, that third phosphate is not just floating around anymore. That third phosphate actually joined onto whatever molecule was receiving that energy, and that process is called phosphorylation. All right, so that pretty much wraps it up for the first section of notes for Unit 3 on basically the intro to cellular energetics. What I'd like for you to work on now is the metabolism worksheet, and keep on working on your vocabulary sheets. It's really important to understand the vocabulary for this unit. The other thing I would like to recommend is there's a great video on YouTube. It's the Hank Green crash course video on thermodynamics. It's about 13 to 14 minutes long. It's a terrific video. I put the link right here. I'm not going to show it right here just to avoid any copyright strikes or things like that. So I definitely would encourage you to watch this. I'm going to put a link below. If this video is posted on YouTube, you can find that link right below this video. And then I would definitely encourage you to watch this. And then we will talk more about enzymes in the next video, and then following that we'll move on to our complicated topics of photosynthesis and cellular respiration.